today's episode, what we're going to be going through is what happens during a tenancy. So just some of the common problems that people find themselves in. And so some of the topics we're going to talk about: maintenance, repairs, modifications, entry rights, and what happens if there's a breach by either the tenant or the rental provider. So just recapping again some of that terminology. If I say renter, it means tenant. If I say rental provider, it means landlord. Real estate agents and rooming house operators stay the same, and leases still in effect, but the proper terminology is rental agreement at this point in time. And so just one of the things that I want to make abundantly clear to everyone is that you can't be evicted for enforcing your rights. So a lot of the times, if the rental provider tries to evict you after you have tried to enforce your rights, whether that's by giving them a breach of duty notice, which I'll discuss a little bit later, or you give them a repair notice and then you coincidentally get an eviction notice, it could be argued that it's a retaliatory eviction notice. But again, it kind of gets a little bit technical, so always feel free to check in with us, but just don't be scared to utilize the rights that have been given to you by the Act. And we'll go through that in a little bit more detail throughout this episode. And it should also be noted that you can't be blacklisted. Technically, it's called a tenancy database, but more colloquially, it's known as being blacklisted. Not something that you can be blacklisted for if you're just enforcing your rights in accordance with what's available in the Act. So jumping into repairs, maintenance, and modifications. So there's been a couple of changes around this with the new amendments in place. But just to start off, one of the things that everyone should know from the get-go is that the rental provider / landlord is required to give you certain basic rights. So one of those is to make sure that the property is in a good state of repair. The law at the moment, or previously, said that it was maintain the premises in good repair, but it's actually now in good repair and is fit and suitable for occupation. So just because the four walls are standing, it doesn't mean that it's fit and suitable. So that additional protection has now come into place. As well as quiet enjoyment. So that's always been around, no changes there, but just to make it clear, it requires that the rental provider take all reasonable steps to ensure that the renter has quiet enjoyment of the premises, which includes utilizing the premises to its fullest extent. So if part of the premises isn't being able to be used because it's damaged and it's not being repaired by the rental provider, well, that could be a breach of your quiet enjoyment. And that along brings, compensation rights and whatnot, which we won't go into today, but something to kind of keep in mind of. And I just wanted to recap some of the minimum standards. We did go through this in the last slide, but these are some of the new things that have come in with the amendments in March. And basically, if you want to, you can refer back to the slide previously, but just as a quick recap, with locks, deadlocks are needed on all external doors where possible, and at least a lock that can lock from inside and outside with a key. Windows don't need locks. Vermin-proof bins are pretty self-explanatory, just bins that rats and other vermin can't enter, including recycling bins. With mold, that's one of the big changes with the minimum standards. It needs to be mold free and damp free, because dampness possibly leads to mold. And so that could also be a structural issue as well. So, now there's a structural soundness requirement. And with these minimum standards comes checks and balances that the rental provider must do every couple of years or so. And so now when you're renting a property, it should be free from mold and dampness, and it is a minimum standard that you're protected by. With some of the common problems that we're going to see, a lot of those fall within repairs, and there's two different types of repairs. There's urgent repairs and then there's non-urgent repairs. So basically, urgent repairs are defined under the Act and includes these here on the screen. So, burst water services, serious roof leaks, but the one that will capture a lot of the things that aren't listed here is basically this one in the bottom second line here, which says any fault or damage that makes the dwelling unsafe or insecure, including pest infestation or presence of mold or dampness. So we've got a specific definition in the Act now, which tells you what is an urgent repair. So basically anything that's not listed here and not covered by this any fault or damage makes the dwelling unsafe definition will be classed as a non-urgent definition. So pretty easy in that sense to define whether it's urgent or non-urgent. If you're not sure, that's really the point where VCAT is the only body that can make that determination. But if we can try to class it under one of the categories, it'll either be urgent or non-urgent. And the reason why that's important is because there's two different types of repair processes. So there's urgent repairs and non-urgent repairs processes. They're similar but slightly different in the sense that with an urgent repair, it's a 4-step process. Non-urgent repairs are 3 steps. With urgent repairs, well, with both of them really, you need to notify the rental provider in the first instance that a repair is needed. And this is preferably done in writing. With an urgent repair, if it doesn't get fixed within a reasonable time, you can organise for the repairs to be done yourself up to $2,500. But you do need to make sure that the invoice is being sent to the rental provider within 7 days. Written notice of the costs of that repair. And then with step 3, what happens then is if the landlord or the rental provider doesn't reimburse you for that amount, you can apply to VCAT to have that amount reimbursed to you. You are entitled to that amount back. And then if you can't afford $2,500, not everyone has that amount sitting in their bank account for repairs, you can go to VCAT first to try to get a repair order put in place, and that will be listed within 2 business days. So that's the process for urgent repairs. Again, if you're not sure whether it falls under urgent or non-urgent, you can always make the application as an urgent repair and then also a non-urgent repair. Have a chat to us about those circumstances so we can go in a little bit more detail about it, because there are a few intricacies there, but this is just the main gist of it, so you know roughly what you're getting yourself into. With non-urgent repairs, notify the landlord. If they don't fix it within 14 days, you go to Consumer Affairs Victoria to get an independent report made for you, and then Consumer Affairs Victoria will provide you with that report, and then you can go to VCAT to get an order saying that that item needs to be fixed or repaired. Normally, if you go to VCAT, that's listed within 7 business days. So there's just that slight difference between the two. With the 2 repairs processes. These slides will be provided after the episode or after the webinar is finished. I'll send that out to everyone by email, so you'll have all this content. With modifications, some of the things that have changed now is that you don't need consent for certain works at the property anymore. So with fixtures, alterations, additions or renovations at the property, you usually do need consent from the rental provider to do so, but now there's certain things that don't need to get consent first. I'll go through that in a sec. But basically with modifications, renters are allowed to do minor modifications now without consent, and the landlord or rental provider can't unreasonably refuse modifications. There's certain things that they can, like, if it's a heritage listing house, or if it's going to be, drilled holes in concrete or brick walls, then yes, there's going to be some exclusions there. And with any modifications, additions, renovations done to the property, the renter still has the duty to return the property in the state that it was in before the fixture or the modification was made. So, if you paint the wall pink, you might need to return it to white after you leave the property. But these are some of the things that you no longer need consent for. So, picture hooks and screws, brackets and all those things, that's perfectly fine. But again, unless it's on a brick or concrete wall, LED light bulbs can be changed without consent now. Wall anchoring things on the on walls, again, no brick and concrete, but if you wanted to hang a projector or something up, that's fine now without needing consent. Water efficient shower heads, that's going to be really helpful, but you need to retain the old one and replace it once you leave. Same things with security lights, alarm systems. Child gates, you don't need consent for anymore. Permanent, non-permanent window film or installation. So, if you're putting like a tinted kind of film on your window, as long as you can remove it after without causing damage, that's not a problem. Wireless doorbells, curtains and blinds, again, as long as the originals are retained. Child safety locks on windows and doors, as well as locks on letterboxes. But locks on letterboxes shouldn't be a problem anyways, because you're not causing any damage by leaving a lock on the letterbox, but just make sure you take it with you once you leave. So that's basically all the repairs, modifications that we'll go through today. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat function about that. No, not yet. Cool. I'm going to breeze on through. So we have entry rights now. So this is a big one that comes through our doors with entry rights and what it means. Basically, I'm going to split this up into two sections. If you're in a private rental, like if you're in a co-tenancy, and the other one is when you're in a rooming house. So there are slight differences between the two, but mainly the same thing. So basically, the landlord can only enter the property if they do this properly. So if they've entered the property for a valid purpose, they give you proper notice, and then they're entering within a reasonable manner, there is an obligation to let them into the property. And so with that, we'll go back to this slide and look at why you can enter a property, or why the rental provider / landlord can enter a property. And generally, well, actually, I've actually put in the notice period that the landlord's supposed to give you before they enter the property as well under these sections. So they can enter for general inspections, but general inspections can only be done once every 6 months for private rentals. With repairs and maintenances, that's with 24 hours notice. Of course, all of these can be waived. These notice periods can be waived if there's an agreement between rental provider and landlord / rental provider, between the renter. And then showing the property to renters or potential buyers. With this one, the renter is entitled to compensation. It's normally $30 a day or half of a daily amount of rent, whichever's the higher amount of those two. And normally you're required to give 48 hours, or the rental providers required to give 48 hours notice before they enter the property. With the property being valued by a real estate agent or like a mortgagee, that's normally 7 days notice. This is one of the new ones, taking photos or videos for the purpose of advertising the property. So only under certain circumstances they can be it can be limited, in the sense that you have private things around the property that can't be removed, and if they take a photo or video, it's going to be exposing your private information. That would be some of the reasons as to why you can object. But normally now it is allowed for the purposes of if the rental provider wants to sell the house or wants to put the property back up on the market for rent. With the rental provider, they need to give you reasonable grounds if they want to enter the property because they believe that you have breached one of your duties as a renter. They need to have reasonable grounds to believe that. So they can't just be like, oh, I had a hunch, my gut feeling was telling me that, you damaged the house. No, they need to have reasonable grounds to believe that, you did a video chat with them and in the background they saw like a crack on the wall or something like that. It needs to be reasonable. And they need to give you 24 hours notice before they enter the property for that purpose. And the last reason why they can enter is if there's a family violence matter happening at the property. They have 24 hours to give you notice before they can enter for that. And of course, you're protected for any damage or loss during any time the rental provider enters the property, whether it's for any of these reasons, and you can claim back compensation if anything is lost or damaged. So then the next thing that we need, that the rental provider needs to do before they enter, sorry, this one is rooming houses. So the last slide that we went through were for private rentals. For rooming houses, like I said, it's similar but kind of different in the sense that if you're in a rooming house, the rooming house operator can show the room around to a prospective renter by giving you 24 hours notice. With showing the house to a buyer or a lender, they need to also give you 24 hours notice. Entry required, so the rooming house operator can carry out a duty under the Act is 24 hours notice. So like if there's a damage or a repair that they need to go in and have a look at. Rooming house operators or real estate agents can enter if they believe that there's been a failure to comply with the agreement or with the Act, then they need to give you 24 hours notice. That again would be for like a breach of duty because, you know, they believe that you're illegally subletting or you've got a pet where you didn't get approval for it or you've caused damage, something like that. And room inspections can only happen once every 4 weeks and they need to give you 48 hours notice. They can enter at any time if there is an emergency and entry is necessary to save life or valuable property. So this is for rooming houses. And then basically with valid notice, it needs to be in writing. It needs to state the reason why the rental provider wants to enter the property, and it needs to be given either by post or it needs to be physically handed over between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. They can't just slide it under your door 7 o'clock at night and say, you know, I've given you notice. Back then, electronic notice used to be accepted, like via email or by text. Now it's only either via post or by being directly handed over to you. If it's not one of these methods, it's not valid notice. And these are some of the grounds in which a renter may be able to refuse entry. So if there's a VCAT order, because you know the renter's gone to VCAT and said, no, I don't want this person entering because they didn't do it right, and there's an order saying the rental provider can't enter, then they can't enter. Entry isn't for a valid reason. So one of those things that were listed on the last 2 slides, rental provider wanted to do a general inspection, but it wasn't within the 6-month or the 4-week period, depending on your type of accommodation. The rental provider wants to enter, but I'll start again. The rental provider wants to enter because the renter has given a notice to vacate, but it's before the last 14 days of the rental agreement. So basically, as a renter, if I say, hey, Mr. Rental Provider, I want to leave, and then the rental provider wants to do advertisements and show the property around to a prospective renter, then within the last 14 days, they can do that. Anything out of that, you can say, nope, I'm going to refuse entry because that's not allowed. The notice wasn't given to them properly. So like I was saying in the previous slide, if it wasn't given by post or it wasn't given to you personally between the hours of 8 a.m. and 6 p.m., then that's not valid notice. If the rental provider tries to make you leave the property for the inspection, you can also say, no, I'm going to ask that you leave my property because even though you're entitled to come in to inspect the property, you're not entitled to evict me for the period or the duration while you're doing the inspection. And the last thing is, the visit isn't between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. So if they come at 7 p.m. or they come at 7:30 in the morning, or if it's a public holiday, you can say, no, I don't want you to enter the property because it's not within the agreed times, unless within at least 7 days in advance, you and the rental provider have agreed that those times work for you. Then you can, then they can visit outside of those hours. And so just going back to this slide again, just to recap, the rental provider needs a valid purpose to enter your property. They need to give you proper notice. They need to enter in a reasonable manner. So they can't stay longer than what's necessary for the purpose of their visit. And if they do those 3 things, as a renter, you have to let them into the property, unless there's one of those reasons for refusing entry here on this slide. If not, you're obligated to let them in, and it could be a potential breach of your duties if you don't. So it is a punishable offence for a rental provider or a rooming house operator to enter the property or your room, if you're in a rooming house, without following the above requirements. And if you feel that your rights are going to be breached, call us ASAP. And so last thing I'm going to go through, and I really apologize for going over. So if anyone needs to leave, please feel free to. This session will be recorded and put on our website. But if you can hang out for a little bit more, I want to go through breach of duty notices and what happens if either yourself or the rental provider breach their duties. So basically, a breach of duty notice is given when someone has not met their obligations, either to the under the Residential Tenancies Act or to the agreement itself. And then if someone has breached their duty, you can issue them with something called a breach of duty notice, which is just a formal written warning saying that you've not met your obligations, please meet them otherwise. So basically, for a breach of duty notice to be valid, it needs to have these 4 things. And I say must include because otherwise it's not valid. So the breach of duty notice needs to tell you what you've breached. So whether it's a part of the agreement, like you didn't pay your rent, or you didn't get approval for something that was needed, or you broke the law under the Residential Tenancies Act. So that's something like not getting approval for a pet when consent is needed, or subletting without getting consent that's needed prior to. And the second thing that you need to do is make sure that in the notice it says that it basically tells you what you need to do. So whether something needs to be fixed or something needs to be compensated for, and it also needs to say that the breach can't happen again, basically. And it sounds a little bit redundant saying that the breach can't happen again, but if it doesn't say in the notice somewhere that a similar breach cannot happen again, then again, that's not valid. The third thing that needs to be included is that it needs to basically quantify for you the loss or damage that was incurred because of that breach. So it's one thing to say there's a breach, it's another thing to say what that resulted in. So if it's a breach because a wall was damaged, it needs to include the approximate amount of the loss or the extent of the damage that's being claimed for or being putting you on notice for. And if any of the things don't, basically, it also needs to include that if you don't comply with the notice, then the person giving you the breach of duty notice has the option to apply to VCAT for a compliance order or a compensation order. And basically, a compliance order is saying you must comply with what the order says. So, if it's something because the property is dirty and it hasn't been cleaned, and the compliance order might say something along the lines of the renter has 7 days to rectify this problem and, clean the property. And if you don't do that, then that's a breach of a compliance order. And then a compensation order is a little bit different in the sense that if it's something that can't be fixed, it might be a matter of saying, well, you need to compensate the person. So either in a monetary value, usually. So those are the 2 kinds of orders that you can get for a breach of duty notice. And so if the rental provider or the rooming house operator breaches their duty to you, you can issue the rental provider with a notice. And so these are the notice periods that they have under here to tell them how quickly they need to rectify the problem. So the first problem that you can give the notice to the rental provider for is if they haven't ensured your quiet enjoyment of the property. So that covers peace, comfort, and privacy. So if they're rocking up at your house at like 9 o'clock at night without any prior notice and they didn't give you your entry notices, like we said in the previous slides, that could be a breach. And you can issue them with a breach to say, please stop, you're not complying with the law. You're now encroaching on my peace, comfort, and privacy. You have 7 days to stop. The other thing that you can issue a notice for is the premises isn't suitable for occupation. So this is before you move into the property. Or you can even give it to them during during the tenancy if there's an issue that arises. But that's to say that, well, this property needs to be fixed because it's no longer safe or suitable. The other thing that you can also issue a notice for is the property is not maintained in a good condition. So like what I was saying before with the minimum standards, the landlord has, or the rental provider has a duty to make sure that the property is in a good condition. You can issue them a notice for that. If you need to replace water, gas or electrical appliances, fittings or fixtures that don't meet the minimum efficiency standards. So now most of those high energy or high water items in the household need to be like 3 or 4 stars upwards. And if it's not, you can apply by giving the landlord a breach of duty notice to say that you need to rectify those things to make sure they meet standards. And the last thing is if windows and locks haven't been appropriately adhered to. Of course, this isn't an exclusive list. This is just some of the main ones that you can give a breach of duty notice for. Contact us if there's any other issues. You can basically issue a breach of duty for notice for anything that's being breached in your tenancy agreement or under the Act. And if as a renter, you receive a breach of duty notice, these are some of the things that you can receive a notice for. So refusing to allow entry when the rental provider has met their obligations by causing a nuisance, interfering with peace and comfort of neighbours, damage to the property or common areas if you're in an apartment complex, not keeping the property reasonably clean. That is also one of the duties that you have as a renter. Installing fixtures or making changes at the property without consent. So this is, of course, excluding those modifications that are now allowed without consent. So things like, wanting to install a dishwasher or wanting to install a, clothing line in the backyard that requires you to dig hole and pour concrete and stuff like that. Not returning the property to the way it was before you installed the fixture or renovation or appliance. Not giving the rental provider a key to the new doors or window locks if you've changed those. So this is what the breach of duty notice will look like. So this one is the form to the landlord, and this one's the form to the renter. Basically same thing, just that title looks a little bit different, but this is essentially what the form looks like, and you're just going through why there's a breach and what the loss of that resulted in. And so if you ignore a breach of duty notice or you've repeatedly breached the same thing, then basically there's the VCAT option, like what I was saying before, with either the compliance order or the compensation order. If the breach does occur 3 times and a valid breach of duty notice has been issued for the previous 2 times, then you could actually be found to be issued with a notice to vacate, or you as the renter can say, I'm deciding to leave now because 3 times the chance, you haven't done anything about the issue. I'm not sitting around for this. I'm entitled to leave. So that's, again, only if the breach occurs 3 times and you've served the breach of duty notice properly the first 2 times. So if you were to find yourself in that circumstance, like what these dates here say, that if you issue this to the rental provider, they have 14 days to fix this. If they still don't fix it, you can issue them with another notice. They have another 14 days to fix it. And then if they still don't fix it the 3rd time round, you can just say, see you later. Here's my notice of intention to vacate. I'm out of here. So that's basically what that means if you're found in a situation of repeated breaches. So again, we've gone over. I thank you so much for all your time and your patience with this. That basically brings us to the end of the episode.